to the northern part of the island of Luzon. We were loaded on New Year's Day on another ship where they had just unloaded the Japanese horse cavalry. They put us down in the hold where these horses had just been, and we had no food. The horse manure was about a foot deep on the floor, but we had to lay in. Many of the men were so hungry that I actually saw them picking out grains of corn out of the corn that had passed through the intestines of the horse and began eating it. Our ration was about 4 spoonfuls of water a day. That was all the food and water we got during these 10 days. And now the same place we had just left, San Fernando, the American troops landed there 4 days later. We always jokingly said we smelled bacon and eggs when we left. At last, about January 9th, 1945, we reached Formosa along the China coast, which we now call Taiwan. We pulled into harbor. The American dive bombers spotted us again, which of course our ship was marked, and they bombed and sunk us again. Nearly half the prisoners were killed. Again, I had to thank God for saving me. Men were killed all around me. 2 men sitting on both sides of me were killed immediately. Fortunately, I only got a slight leg wound. The ship, being in shallow water, immediately settled to the bottom after running aground. The bodies that were there left on there, about 400 killed, were left on there for approximately 1 week. Some of the bodies were fully intact, and some were just blown to pieces. If you ever tried to pick up a dead, rotting body in the tropical climate where we were, you didn't pick up the body, you picked it up in pieces. You can imagine what it was like. The bodies were so thick, black, and had swollen up, so that when you touched it with your hand, your fingers would sink into the flesh, and all you could do was pull out chunks at a time. They were covered with flies, and looking at these rotted corpses, you could see was maggots were crawling out of their eyes and in every opening in their bodies. After we cleaned up the bodies, we burned them and buried the remains on the island of Taiwan. And today, there's a large cross monument there marking the spot where this happened. Then we loaded on another ship, and we started for Japan once more. On this ship, there was a shortage of water. Our food ration was 3 spoonfuls of water a day. And we drew our rations, but we would kneel down, and the distributor would pour it in their mouth. And looking out over the ocean with all the water, there wasn't any of it that we could drink. I could go a long time without eating food, but I could hardly go very long without drinking any water. As we got further north, the weather became very cold. All the clothes we had were what we had on, and when we jumped off our first ship. Many of the men had none at all. As for me, I had a pair of undershorts, nothing more. On this particular ship, we had a tarpaulin stretched over us, hanging on poles. The weather began turning so cold and freezing, with ice and snow started falling, and you would hold up in your mouth, hoping to catch a few flakes just to have something to drink. We did discover on the ship there were barrels of sugar in a hole below us. By carefully lifting some boards, we made a small opening where we could get down in the hole where the sugar was. We did it for 2 reasons. Because the sugar would give you some energy, and the sacks that contained the sugar could be made into blankets to keep us warm. We were freezing to death because, like I said, all I had were undershorts or G-strings. So we had to keep the sacks hidden during the daytime, and at nighttime we'd cover up with these sacks to keep warm. The Japanese warned us that if we were caught with any sugar, we would be killed. One day a Japanese soldier looked down and saw an American digging in the sugar. Immediately he reported it to his commander, and the commander ordered the man that was taking the sugar to come forward now, come up on deck and be punished. Well, you can't imagine what we looked like, having lived in manure and filth for about 3 months and being sunk twice. We were dirty, hadn't shaved our hair and beards, which were very long. We all had manure caked all over our bodies, and flies were constantly biting us. Nobody knew who was guilty for stealing the sugar, because we all were, and we didn't know who had been seen, so no one would go forward. They kept insisting that the man be sent up and take his punishment. They immediately started getting grenades and machine guns ready to finish us off. The commander said, "That man must come forward in 5 minutes or we're going to kill all of you." And he meant every word of it. He got out his watch, and every minute he told us how much time we had left. In the last minute, the soldiers cocked the machine gun. He then started counting the last minute down. Several times I thought I was going to die but escape. This time I knew for certain I was a goner, along with all the men, and I began to pray. He counted down the last 10 seconds, and his men readied the machine gun. In the last 5 seconds, a Catholic chaplain, who had never stolen any sugar at all, volunteered to go up and receive the punishment in order that the rest of our lives would be saved. He was taken and beaten until both his legs and arms and his ribs were all broken. He was then thrown down in the hole where he died a few hours later. Because if he hadn't, I wouldn't be here giving you this talk tonight, because we would have all been killed. His name was Chaplain Francis J. Adams from Cleveland, Ohio, the United States Navy. And without any thought, and being faithful to God and his fellow man, he laid down his life for the rest of us so we could all live. I thought of the famous Bible quotation, "Greater love hath no man than he will lay down his life for his fellow man." And we were on the ship for nearly 2 weeks. Every night at dark, the Catholic chaplains who were still on board would lead the group in prayer. Catholics, Protestants, and Jews alike knelt in the prayers that were said. Never were prayers said with more meaning and sincerity behind them than were these prayers. One could almost feel the presence of God in our midst. One felt like he was talking to him in person. The Japanese lieutenant that ordered his duty also had his neck stretched at the military tribunal. There were quite a few of them that paid the penalty for war crimes during the war. The weather was getting bitter cold. Sleet and snow were falling. Men froze to death every day. Many mornings I woke up and men sleeping next to me, cold to death. They were thrown overboard so fast that it kept the detail of carrying out the dead. Daily the chaplains would say a few prayers for their souls. Then they were passed over to the sharks, which continually followed our ship. On the night of January 29, 1945, our convoy was attacked by an American submarine. Several of the ships were sunk, and we were expecting it any minute. Luckily, we got by with a few near misses. We arrived on Japan on my birthday, January 30th, 1945. I was 31 years old, and a happy birthday it was for me to get some cooked rice. There were 235 of us left out of the nearly 4,000 that left Manila. I weighed 92 pounds, was suffering from amoebic dysentery and exposure. We climbed off the ship, we walked barefooted and practically nude on the cold-sea icy decks, and sleet and snow coming down, and a cold north wind whipping through us. We were unloaded and sent out to a nearby prison camp. We were taken to other prison camps nearby. I was very sick and I was taken to a hospital. We were given some warm clothes. I was in the hospital for 30 days, which I was given decent treatment. There I remained for 3 months. During this time, my weight went up to 112 pounds. The Japanese commander of this prison camp was very kind to us. He actually shed tears when he saw us. He stated, "I can't believe my fellow countrymen would treat anyone like this." That Japanese officer became an employee of the United States government. In the Army of Occupation, he rose to a very high rank in the Army of the United States. So he too was rewarded for his kindness. We all saw to that after the war was over. We testified at his hearing and let them know what he had done for us. Inside the camp, I met fellow POWs who had been in prison there since 1942 and forced to work in nearby factories. While working in these factories, the POWs sabotaged products and manufacturing equipment, which eventually shut down the factory. American planes dominated the skies over Japan. Bombs were being dropped all around us. 2 large bombs landed our camp, killing and wounding many. Finally, it looked there was going to be an invasion of Japan. So in order to prevent the officers from being recaptured, we were rounded up on April 28, 1945 to be shipped to China. The next day, April 29th, we were loaded on another crowded prison ship and sailed for Korea. There we were put on a train and rode all the way across Korea to Mukden, Manchuria, within 100 miles of the Russian-Siberia border. On August 3rd, the Russian army declared war on Japan, and they came rushing down from the border towards us and crashed the gate to our prison with tanks. And the Russian lieutenant stuck his head out of the tank and said, "You are all free now, thanks to the Red Army of Russia." And he passed out money to us. Many of the freed POWs joined the Russians and attacked nearby Japanese forces. The war was about over and they knew it. The next morning, a B-29 flew over and dropped supplies to us. There was enough in there to last us for 50 years. They dropped so many supplies we didn't know what to do with it. And they kept dropping it where they could find a place to drop it. One interesting thing, there was a young Chinese boy about 20 who I met in the city of Mukden and who could speak English. So he acted as our interpreter. When we left Mukden to come home, we turned over all supplies to him. We told him to do whatever he wanted with it. Well, he shook our hands and said it was quite nice knowing us. He said, "I guess you're going back to America. In America, you have John D. Rockefeller, and China got beat." There was at least $4 to $5 million worth of supplies that we turned over to him. He got carts and loaded up supplies. He had close to 400 to 500 carts loaded with these supplies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, 600 years ago, Marco Polo made a trip to China, and he came back with loads of stories about it, and nobody believed him. They thought everything he said was just a bunch of lies. And later, laying on his deathbed, his priest came to his bedside. He said, "Marco, please recant what you said. Please tell the truth." And Marco raised his head and said, "Damn you, I haven't told you the half of it." Thank you all for listening to my father's speech.